Test.
Testing.
All right.
All right. So today we're going to spend some time looking at how we can use data to make better decisions. I'm Mark Allen. I'm a director with HBR Consulting, been in the legal consulting space for about a decade and working with the Team Connect platform and within this ecosystem for about just as long here.
And hi, everyone. I'm Rohit Gulati. This is actually what we looked like this morning. We just grew the beards for this. So I'm a director as well. I've been working with corporate law departments for over 10 years, doing a lot of operations and technology implementations, a lot of MeterTech products as well. We're going to go over today's agenda and goals. I'm going to actually walk you through 3 real-world case studies of how data can be used. We're going to talk about tips for thoughtful approach to design. We're going to talk about once you have the design for matter management in place, how do you leverage that design? And then we'll leave some time for Q&A in the end. So real quick, the topic for today is really focused on utilizing matter data to better manage risk and develop go-forward strategy. So we heard Jason talk about this morning as well, where the legal department's perception can be changed from a department that says no to somebody who is more strategically aligned with the business functions, the company, and the environment in which they operate. And so what we want to do is walk you through some examples of how matter management design can actually help you achieve just that. We want to talk about becoming a proactive business partner by leveraging legal data more strategically.
Yeah, so, and I will say that as we get through this, you're going to see some overlap with Jason's presentation this morning. I'll note that we had no preview of that, but we couldn't have asked for a better foundation to be laid for the details that we're going to dive into here.
Excellent. So diving right into the case studies. So the first case study I want to go over is about a company, a healthcare company, who was trying to come up with a settlement strategy across all their matters. So what I want to do is actually walk you through their thought process using a fishbone diagram, just identifying all of the different factors that play into the settlement strategy. So the first thing that the client looked at was, what are the different types of matters that exist in my system? They looked at areas that have high volume, they looked at areas that have high spend, and how those play in with the overall settlement process. Now, one thing we do with the clients quite often as part of the matter management design is come up with a meaningful matter taxonomy. This matter taxonomy then lays the foundation for reporting, for metrics, and really is one of the most fundamental parts of a matter management system. We also looked at courts and judges, specifically if there were trends in certain decisions that were made by certain types of by certain judges, and then also location of the courts, as well as the jurisdiction. Another data point that was examined is the parties involved. So not only the named parties, so entities who may be part of the actual settlement, but also the opposing counsel, and looking at trends. How does a settlement fare when a certain opposing counsel has been part of the same process before? And as well as any inside counsel or help that you may have hired as part of vendors or outside counsel are concerned. And lastly, looking at the settlement amounts. So when we put all of that together, we saw that for HR matters or EEO matters, the client saw that for a specific region, the combination of venue jurisdiction as well as a particular named party resulted in an average settlement which was 150% higher than all of the other matters that were being settled in the same region. They took it one step further, saw that in all of the other regions, the combination of venue jurisdiction and named parties resulted in average settlement amounts that were 80% to 200% higher. So the client was able to then take this information and roll it into their overall settlement strategy for EEO matters. I'm going to hand it over to Mark, who's going to show you a slightly different take on the same.
Yep, so we're going to look at another example where a client was interested in settlement information. Before I move to that slide, has anybody gone through a similar exercise in their internal departments where they've looked at similar components to this and sort of backed into? I see Mike puts his hand up. Anybody else? Anything that you looked at that Rohit didn't outline here? Just curious amongst the audience. Any components that you saw driving case costs?
Combination of known plaintiff's counsel in venues and jurisdictions.
Yep.
A lot of commonality with and sort of flag those.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and that's a great example. So a separate client from this, but we have one that felt over time they were being picked on by certain counsel, right, who were out there poaching, again, on the employment side, but they really knew this client's system. They knew their inner workings, they knew how to drag a case on, and they were spending on average about 80% more every time that was the plaintiff counsel versus the general population of counter counsels that they were working with. So it is interesting how those can drive things and how you can back into a decision about how you handle those cases in a different way. Whether it's fighting them to the death so that person just stops coming at you, or whether it's looking at settling potentially earlier at a lower cost because they know how to drag things on. On that topic, what I'm going to look at here again, I mentioned we're looking at settlements again. This particular client here in scenario, while they were after optimal settlement strategy, they took an entirely different approach to it. So a lot on the screen here, I'll walk through it quickly here, but on this top bar here, what you're going to see is timeline, right? So they broke their cases out into quarters. They tracked data in that way that allowed them to get to a chart like this. First row that we see here, though, is they were tracking over time what's our current settlement option, right? Either what is being demanded of us or what do we think at this point in time we can reasonably settle this case. Sometimes these were best guesses from internal counsel, evaluating their exposure, evaluating the merits of the case. Sometimes this is a number that, it came from numbers they actually derived from negotiations, right? Where maybe they countered at 50,000 in month 7 and the counterparty came back at 75. They know that's kind of their floor at that point for some of these. Now, the second row that you'll see down here as far as the numbers is running external cost, right? So this is just marrying up the actual external counsel or third-party vendor cost over the duration of these cases over time. And then finally, down here, this is internal costs. So they were looking at what amount of time are our internal attorneys allocating to these cases on average, right? This particular client didn't track time, so don't get too nervous here. But they use some, salary information and then in basic guesstimates to get to what are they allocating to these cases. I will caveat and say this particular client had a relatively large volume of cases that they could go back and cull this data from, and they looked at some specific things. So they looked at cases that ran full life cycles, right? And they had a good population of data to look within. But this was really focused on those cases that out of the gate you knew could really go the distance, right? So they had sort of weaned out ones where there was no merit to it. They knew they're going to get a motion to dismiss relatively early in the case, that just a minimal pushback was going to take them to the finish line. So this was a segmented subset of cases that they're really able to analyze. So as we revisit those 3 number bands here, you'll see at the top, one thing that came out pretty clearly is that as they fought these cases, their point in settlement, their dollar amount, what the counterparty was willing to settle at, definitely dropped over time, right? And this is sometimes plaintiff fatigue that they see, right? People, these were customers in this particular case, and after a year, 16 months, these people are tired of fighting this. This isn't their job. This isn't what they're paid to do, and that number that they're willing to settle for got smaller. So focusing independently on this, right, without looking at the bigger picture, that might lead them to believe, we should fight every one of these cases. We're going to have, a lower settle amount in the end. But as they started weaving in the other data points here, right, and most importantly, this external legal fees, they really started to see that not only was it starting to wash out what they were reducing down in terms of their settlement demand reduction. But at a certain point in time, it really started to exceed that number, right? So they were spending way more to continue to fight these cases than they were realizing in benefit from seeing reduced settlement amounts on the tail end of these. So what they were trying to do is hone in on what is the ideal point in time for us to really begin to aggressively pursue settlement options, right? And they, in this particular subset of cases, right, and this could vary depending on the type of litigation or dispute across your portfolio, but for this subset, they really found that their sweet spot was right in that kind of 7 to 9 month mark. If it pushed past that, for the most part, they were having a much higher percentage of cases that they were having to see all the way through to the end, and at a much higher price points as those trajected on. So what did they do with this, right? Okay, it's great that we know this is our target. Well, they put together an incentive plan with their internal and external counsel to really start, when they hit that 7, 8 month mark, if they were still actively fighting these cases, they started to put together incentives to say, how do we reward our counsel for getting to a favorable settlement, right? And these were sort of handled on a case-by-case basis, but then they would come up with a settlement bonus, let's say $20,000, that they would pay out to counsel if they were able to settle within 10% of their target number. Now, we often see, right, that there's sort of different incentives here. So, this number looks a lot better for the outside counsel, not so much for inside. But a lot of people, when you step back and think of it, that $20,000 bonus would take them $60,000, $80,000 in billings to realize those same margins. So when you can set these things up, it can be equally beneficial on both sides. So that $20,000 to you is still $20,000, whether that's legal fees or bonus, but to them, that's the equivalent of getting sometimes $100,000 in fees. Questions on this one? I know it's a lot going on here, but just meant to represent an example of how, with the proper data, you can back into some pretty neat decision-making tools like this. All right. So also looking at a set of claim data, I'm going to talk through a root cause analysis that a utility client went through. I will point out, and I didn't fail to do this on the other side, these numbers are representative. Obviously, we're not displaying client data here. But this was an exercise in which our clients had a rich system full of claim data, and they were saying, let's take a look at ways that we can proactively help the enterprise prevent some of these. So they tried to focus on areas that they were spending a good deal of money, right? So we see our little spikes here around electric contact, system outages, and they backed into what do we know about our ongoing activity in the field for these items. This particular one on electric outages seemed wrong to them. They had invested a ton of money over the last about a decade improving infrastructure, reducing the amount of unplanned outages that are happening, figuring out fail-safes, right? Transformers firing in the back when one goes down. A bunch of investment had happened in the field to reduce how often that was happening, but they weren't seeing what they expected in terms of reduction in claims and ultimately settlements paid on those claims. So as they looked at the volume of claims down here, they realized this number for outages hadn't changed in the way that they were expecting. So what they did though is they ended up having to dive into this data and say, how much of this claim outage or how much of these claim fees did we spend on planned outages versus unplanned? And this pie chunk here really stuck out to them, right? Why are we spending this much money on known outages that are coming, right? Where we know we've got to switch over to a new transformer, we've got to switch sources on something. We know this is coming, it's going to be a 1 hour outage, a 2 hour, a 4 hour. We shouldn't be spending that much, right? Down here, they looked at the percentage breakout of how many of these claims, right? These numbers, the pie charts look pretty close here. About 85% of the claims for outages, 90% of the spend were coming from planned. They knew that didn't seem right. So they dove into this data a little bit more and really got into the field with their business partners and say, how can this be possible, right? This is the data we're seeing on the legal side. Most of the rest of the enterprise didn't have direct access to this, so they were in an ideal position to identify an anomaly like this and then reach out to the business and say, something isn't right here, right? In this particular case, they found a lot of room for improvement on how they were communicating these known outages to their clients and customers. A 5 p.m. outage in a restaurant district on a Friday night is not a good idea, right? And this is where they were seeing claims like this. Food spoilage in places, things where their clients weren't able to proactively manage the downstream effect of an outage, and as a result, they were ending up having to pay for the consequences of that. So this was identified early on, 2015. They worked over the course of that year, reran the data late in 2016, and this is a fantastic example of sort of that holy grail of what legal can do with good data, which is preventive maintenance, right? I mean, it's the front side of these things. So here, you can see in a single year, they reduced the amount of claim dollars being paid out on planned outages by about 89%. So this is something where, and they were in a cost-cutting and saving mode and were allowed to take credit internally as a department for those savings. So something that was pretty neat for them to be able to take advantage of, and something that, as the legal department moves from, as Jason mentioned this morning, this perception of a department of no to somebody like this, which is really kind of the tip of the spear for the enterprise utilizing data that's readily available to them. There's a whole different perception on the value they're bringing now to that company. Any questions on that? So I'll talk a little bit here in a few minutes about some of the design components. We'll tie back to how they got to some of these numbers. I will say that out of the gate, they were tracking sort of the claims on what was electric outage based, but they had to manually go back to a couple years worth of data and tag each one of those hundreds of claims as planned versus unplanned outages, and they had to marry it up with some systems that were on their operational side that really tracked, where are our planned outages. So this was an exercise that took a bit more effort on the front side than they were originally planning, but then allowed them to think strategically, how can we better capture this data on a go-forward basis so that we can run this exact same report or similar reports in a more automated fashion going forward. In this situation, they now have an integration between their claim system, which is currently sitting outside of Team Connect and Team Connect, which ultimately acts as their central hub for data across the department. And then now can run reports across basically all of these data elements from pushing data out of Team Connect. So we're going to flip our example here. We've got one last case study, and this one's going to take a different direction here as far as the subject matter here.
Yep. So the subject matter here is contract management. So tracking risks, your obligations that are stored within the contracts, and any disputes that may result from there. So this is a direct example where you're working closely with your procurement, your sales teams, in order to make sure that obligations are being tracked and they're being followed through to the extent that you can do that. So in this case, a pharma company hired us to take a look at their obligations, how they were being tracked, and come up with an assessment of how we can improve the design. So in this case, we took a look at their contract status, again, using sample data. Here, what we noticed right off the bat was there's just a huge number of contracts that were in a single status, which was just executed, and all of the other statuses were barely used. So this isn't a story about contracts. You see this with matter management as well. Your matters, a lot of them may be active, may be open, and then you may not be closing all of those matters in a timely manner. So this is where we actually worked with the client to come up with a process for managing their contracts and come up with meaningful statuses that weren't, for example, overlapping, for the lack of a better word. So if you look at executed versus active, what's truly the difference between the two? So we worked with them to really define that up front. Another thing that you may notice here is the statuses that track obligations, in this case expired and terminated, were barely being used. So again, an opportunity for improvement where we work with the client to figure out how the obligations should be tracked, who should track them, where they should be tracked. Another example, same client, we looked at their highest volume procurement contracts, and this can be true about your sales contracts as well. Just the level or the number of times the effective date and the expiration dates were being tracked. For effective dates, you can see that not all of them reached 100%, and for expiration dates where you can populate expiration dates, those weren't being tracked very well either. So again, we dug into each one of these areas, came up with processes, policies for tracking those dates and automating some of that, right? So if, for example, if you have a CDA that may not have an expiration date all the time, well, how often should you be revisiting that CDA and looking at it so that you know that those terms are still effective? So that's something we worked through with our client and built out in their system. Any questions? Oh, okay.
All right. So we want to start with the stories. I think that's the part that gets people most excited, right? But really laying the groundwork for what type of analysis can we do. Really, how can we be thinking more strategically about the value we can bring, what we can deliver, the questions that we can answer. But we wanted to tie this back to how can a thoughtful design provide for the availability of that data. So we try to bring this down to four concise tips for a thoughtful approach here. So tip number one was begin with the end in mind. So really, as you're looking at the data that you should be tracking, what are you ultimately going to do with that, right? We could have 150 fields on our matter. If we're not doing anything with that, even if we're populating it, how useful is that data? So we often encourage our clients to think about what are the toughest decisions, as an operational professional or as somebody supporting, your leadership team, have you had to make in the past 12 to 24 months, and what data, if present, would have made those decisions a lot easier, right? So thinking about what are those roadblocks we've come up against, what are the decisions we've had to make that we felt a little unprepared for or not fully informed on, and we wish we had these 10 data points, right? Those are the sort of things that we often start with when we're saying, how do we need to revisit our existing design, or if we're thinking about a design from scratch, right? Maybe we're moving from one system to another or moving to a system for the first time, which is always a good opportunity for these. So looking at current reports or requests that have required significant other efforts to gather and collate that data. So going back to the question about what system were some of those examples coming out of. Both of those were not push-button reports, right? When I was showing the settlement timeline, when I was showing the aggregate data around claims and the utility function, those, at the point in time that analysis was done, took a fair amount of effort. But on a go-forward basis now, they're collecting the right data elements to get to a place where they can push the button on reports like that. So it took a little bit of effort on the front side, but that's the types of things that we encourage people to be thinking about, right? Think about the questions you need to answer when it comes to matter and department strategy, and work backwards to the data required to inform those decisions and answer those questions. So beginning with the end in mind.
Real quick, so adding to what Mark has been saying about beginning with the end in mind, and especially if you have a system that you're already using, sometimes the design becomes out of sync with your process, and what you end up doing is tracking information in any text field that's available to you. So the matter name is now such and such length, you have the counterparty name in there, you have the effective date in there. So those are target-rich areas where you can pull those data points. You're capturing those anyways in the matter name, put them in a structured data field that you can then search and report upon and get some of these metrics much more easily.
And don't be afraid to do away with data too, right? So oftentimes when we're doing a migration, somebody will say, let's talk about the fields that are required in your design, and they'll say, it's all the fields that are in our old system. And we'll say, okay, that's a good starting point, right? Then you run the analysis and figure out that 50% of those fields haven't been touched in 3 years, right? With no plan to change that going forward. So while it's important to think, holistically about adding to your data components, not being afraid to do away with a bunch of things that are just taking up room on the screen there as well. And don't forget the basics, right? So oftentimes we get, we're thinking through the complex part, right? We're going back to the settlement timeline. We had to track negotiations over time with that, right? Those are some complex components, but a lot of people forget to start at the very basics, right? Anybody know the 5 W's, right? Something that we learned early in life. Who, what, where, when, why. As I was looking up the 5 W's, right, both to validate that in fact is the right term and make sure I knew them, the things that popped up on Google, the first images are grade school pamphlets here, right? So this is our friend the bee, some sort of alien creature up there, right? This isn't something I pulled out of a professional manual, certainly not a Team Connect training guide that we've delivered, right? Another one here, right, the story detective, right? So this is often, taught in grade school when you're reading a story, you answer these questions. Who is it about? Where did it happen? When did it happen, right? And I included these just to show that this is how elementary this really is, right? Both literally and figuratively when it comes to thinking about our design. But oftentimes we will get to a place where historically somebody goes to run something or answer a question. Maybe you're transferring a caseload, somebody's won the lottery, they're moving away, and they've got 15, 20 active cases, and somebody can't go into their matter management system and answer these 5 questions. Who are the counterparties? Where did this happen? Why did this happen, right? What is the claim? And if you can't start at that foundation, you're going to have a hard time doing some of the really cool stuff that we showed earlier, right? So don't forget the basics, right? So looking at demand and exposure, right? What was the original demand? What's our estimated exposure? How are we negotiating or seeing that number move over time? So don't be so static with it too, right? So if we enter that on day 1, but over the course of a case, we know that number's changing. A lot of our clients visit that on a quarterly basis, right? But looking at regularly keeping those numbers up to date, so when you're running reports like that or you need to make decisions, you've got right time data there. And then looking at costs along timelines. So this is, as you move to a product like Team Connect and you move to the e-billing portion of it, this becomes quite easy, right? You can see, you can track over the duration of your case, what are you spending based on your electronic billing efforts there. This part, gets people a little stirred up, internal efforts. We have friends, like some of ours in the utility space here who are mandated to track time, others who don't, but there are ways to get to internal effort and internal costs without doing time tracking, that we're seeing a growing desire to get more detailed with that information. And then the outcome and resolution information, right? So looking at what was the final outcome of cases. I think we all get so excited that they're over that sometimes we don't go back and put this information. And this is one of the highest areas that we see our clients have to go back and retroactively add information when they're looking to do more detailed reports like that. So having good resolution information at the close of a case. And then getting into the weeds where it matters to you, right? So as we looked at some of those data elements, a lot of you in this audience are not going to be tracking electrical contact as a claim type, right? Or even having a volume of claims that would necessitate an exercise like that. But when it comes to that detailed data, thinking about what's material to you, your company, your department, and starting with that information. So if we're doing a lot of business-to-business information, we don't have that volume of customer-related claims, right? But we do have a lot of high-value contracts, and we need to get detailed in the information that we're capturing related to those contracts, right? What's our exposure information, contract types, terms, counterparties, right? In a way that allows us to make some informed decisions within our contract base and our real risk pool for our company, right? If I'm in high tech, right? Intellectual property is going to make up a lot of our department and our focus. And so we're going to work towards thinking about, in a piece of litigation, what's the volume of patents here, right? Who are the counterparties? Is this a non-practicing entity, right? A patent troll, or is this a tier 1 competitor that has the ability to, make a meaningful impact to our bottom line, right? The value of the product that this is tied to. So those sort of things, right? Those are 2 very different pieces, but it's going to change based on who you are and what you're delivering. And then don't be afraid to look at related cases, right? So if I have a contract dispute, do I need to reiterate a bunch of information that I answered on that contract matter, or can I pull it by relating those two data records? All right, and then last but not least on this, catch up where you need to, right? If you need to go back and enter historical information to get meaningful reports, don't be afraid to do it where it makes sense. But think strategically about that, right? What are the reports that you really need that if somebody just sat down and put some time into entering the last 3 years worth of resolution on our top cases, it can make a big impact to us. And then remember that if the data isn't there historically, beginning to capture it today will change next year, right? So the title of this, right, is looking backwards for a better future. A lot of times we'll say, oh, well, I don't have 3 years worth of that data. But then 3 years passes and you say, oh, I wish in 2017 when Mark was telling me to, I would have started capturing these 4 pieces of information, right? So be thoughtful about what decisions you can make today and how those can impact you down the road. So a lot of words on that slide. Try to just recap them here on this one. Begin with the end in mind, right? Think about what we're ultimately looking to get to. Don't forget our basics, right? Our 5 W's, and we'll throw in a how there. And then get into the weeds where it matters to you. Catch up where it makes sense, but remember it's never too late to start. So if you're afraid about looking backwards, think about looking forward. All right.
All right, so we've talked about creating thoughtful design, thoughtful matter management design in the system. So once the design is in place, you're capturing the data. How do you go about leveraging that design, leveraging that data to now come up with trends and all the cool analytics, right? So again, beginning with the end in mind. So what is it that you're trying to achieve? If you can articulate that question, then it becomes easier to identify those metrics that you want to measure and how you want to compare those metrics and see those trends. Are you trying to get a better sense for your contractual obligations, or is it something else, your spend? So come up with that end in mind, and that end could look something like this. You can have a dashboard with a lot of cool metrics available to you. So this is just a screenshot from our Council Command Business Intelligence tool. So it's showing how spend is trending over the different regions because we are capturing regions on the matters. We are looking at spend by different practice groups and company leads because we are capturing that information on our design. We got staffing summary by level because that's coming in the line items on the invoices. So what are the metrics that you're trying to measure, and how do you want to present those? If you think about that early on, then you're going to be targeted in identifying your data sources. You're going to be targeted in that data cleanup exercise, which can get very, very extensive. Mark, anything to add here?
Yeah, I guess I'll pause here for a second. Looking through some of the topics that we've discussed here, some of the case studies that we've walked through, has anybody any examples from the audience on something exciting that you all have done within your teams? Similar in a similar vein to this. I know somebody's got something. Come on. All right, we'll move on, but I don't trust that the answer is actually no, right? I know some, yeah. Well, so that's a good point. Definitions of exciting may vary, but these are the kind of things that HBR that get us jazzed up. So, but honestly, so just tying back to what Rohit's saying, really thinking about, you'll see this graph, and sometimes it feels intimidating if you're in a situation now where there is nothing that close to this that sits within your repertoire, but it really is. Starting thoughtful in the beginning process allows for this to become very, very easy. And it isn't as arduous as I think a lot of people think it is. It's taking the time, sitting down and thinking through those components and figuring out how do we get to something, whether we, maybe we're a single country company, right? We're not operating internationally. This means nothing to us. Mm-hmm. That's not the relevant point here, right? It's thinking about what is relevant to us, what is important to us, and how do we get to a place where we've got something that we can display like this, and intra-department and outside of it as well. I know Jason mentioned earlier, right, PG&E's example this morning where they received a round of applause when presenting this out to the rest of the C-suite, right? How do you get yourself to a position where you're making decisions like that aren't just impacting the day-to-day within the legal department, but are changing some aspects of the enterprise and how you're serving them? Okay.
So just building through the approach then, I talked about identifying your objectives, your desired outcomes, coming up with those questions up front, identifying those factors, so kind of thinking about the fishbone diagram that we were looking at. What are the different factors that may influence the outcome, thinking through those, thinking through the metrics that you want to measure over time. And then going into number 3, what are the sources of data? Is it a single system that you have? Is it multiple systems? Are they all within your firewall? Are they all within your enterprise? Or do you need to reach out to LexisNexis or Westlaw or something to pull the data? Can you rely on the data quality? So often you may have partially completed data that doesn't look too promising. So an assessment of that data quality really helps build trust in the outcomes of those metrics. The last thing you want to do is come up with a metric, take it to the general counsel, take it to the CEO, and it's just not right. And then number 5, how will you assess the data, present findings, prepare recommendations? So once you have the data, you have the metrics, how do you measure the trends? How do you compare yourself? How do you benchmark yourself? So that's something you need to think through. Any questions? Nope. Seriously? No questions? All right.
Go ahead.
My main question really goes back to the data, the manual data that may exist in a spreadsheet, and how you can get it really into your Team Connect tool, for example,
Yeah.
so that you can actually get valuable reports and charts as you've all shown today.
Yeah. So the answer there, I mean, from my perspective, and I'll let Rohit chime in as well, is it depends on the data, right? There is some data that is easily captured in Team Connect that belongs there with all the rest of its family members, right? It's all related. There are going to be situations where data resides outside of the system for good reason, right? And it's not going to come in. We've got a client where in their particular situation, they've got reserve data, and it's highly sensitive. They had to keep it in a separate system. Without it turning Team Connect into a SOX compliant system, they cannot move that reserve data in there. So it continues to live out on its own. With a lot of the new reporting platforms, so Rohit was showing an example of our Council Command product. Those are sort of information and system agnostic. So you have opportunities to pull data from multiple sources into a platform or a dashboard like that to the end user, it doesn't matter where the data is coming from, right? So there's a lot of power around some of the newer reporting tools to say, we don't have to have everything in one system. The other side of that, though, is so let's say that it is a data set that belongs in Team Connect, should be in Team Connect. You wish it was there, but you don't have the data entry clerks to bring it all in. As you think through where does this go in your design, there are a fair amount of tools out there that make it relatively easy to import data from a spreadsheet into Team Connect, right? So Team Connect has its native tool to do the data import wizard, where you can take a spreadsheet and pull in information. There's also some products in the market among the partners that would allow you to take relatively complex sets of data and pull them into Team Connect if you're looking to pull in historical information that sits outside of it.
I will also add that part of it is also a prioritization exercise. So up front, if you have the spreadsheet available with the data, that's awesome. But often, that's not the case, and it's always overwhelming to go out there and collect all of the data. So again, going back to that prioritization exercise where you can come up with, here are the matters that are important to me, here are the matter types, or volume, looking at the different parameters and coming up with a subset that you start with, and then you build from there.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when it comes to the prioritization exercise and getting the resources to do it, oftentimes it's people in leadership positions that feel like they're missing some of this data, right? If we sit down with a GC and we say, what information do you wish is readily available coming out of this, right? It tends to come to a lot of higher level reporting. That's a bit different than how on the operations side we're looking day to day. But if we can show end result products like this and say, with some level of investment, both from a time perspective and a cost perspective, we can get to a place where we can run reports like this, we can get you that information, you'll see the prioritization within the department shift upwards and focus on efforts to look backwards on data, and getting that data in the system can become a bit easier.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to understand from my perspective, is this just basically a repository that utilizes ETL tools, be it bespoke or COTS tools, that can import the data, and then you can turn around and turn that data information by dashboards, et cetera, right? That's, if a big picture view, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and it depends on your reporting tools, right? I mean, if
Right.
you're an enterprise that uses business objects or Cognos, right,
Yep.
there's some report writing that needs to go into that,
course.
and it is, you're feeding a data warehouse.
Yep.
If you're using some of the BI intelligence tools that sit out there, the way you deliver that data doesn't always have to be ETL. A lot of our clients, they send us reports that just come out in raw spreadsheets, right? And we're
Right.
importing, we're taking data that
CSV.
otherds doesn't look very pretty and turning it into
Okay.
that. But it's a process that depends on what your reporting mechanisms are, where your output actually needs to end up. But essentially, certainly not in this room and amongst this audience, we would just refer to Team Connect as a repository, right?
Right.
It's so much more powerful than that. But in the end, right, if we look at the simplest construct, it is a repository that houses that data, and users are interacting with it through Team Connect, and then through whatever the reporting output pieces are, we need to figure out a way that we transition that data and turn it into something that's a bit more digestible than that.
Right. So do you also use APIs, or just final
We do,
question?
yeah.
Okay.
So depending on the source tools, we've got, like I said, amongst our client base, what we're doing a lot of the reporting exercises for, we basically, any form of transmission you can think of, we do it, right? We pick
Gotcha.
up files from SFTPs, we do API pushes and pulls, we have some ETL jobs that run, and a lot of that comes back to what's their internal infrastructure, and for some of them, what are they allowed to do, right? Sometimes it has to be through SFTP based on their internal
Of course.
compliance
All right.
protocol.
Thank you.
All right, great questions. Anybody else in the audience? All right. Well, if you do have further questions, feel free to reach out to either Rohit or myself, in regards to this data or thinking through these processes as you get back and look at your own design and look to get closer to something like that, or the ability to make decisions like that. All right.
Thank you.